My name is Mark, and for 8 years, I thought my life was everything I could have ever dreamed of. I was married to Emma, the most incredible woman I've ever known. She's the kind of person who makes an impression everywhere she goes. Confident without being overbearing, effortlessly charismatic, and driven in a way that inspired everyone around her. Emma wasn't just my wife, she was my partner in every sense of the word. We built a life together that felt unshakable. Our home wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary, filled with Sophie's laughter, the smell of Emma's favorite lavender candles, and the kind of warmth that comes from shared memories. Sophie, our 5-year-old daughter, was the heart of that home. Watching her grow, her endless curiosity, her boundless energy, was the greatest joy of my life. She's a perfect blend of Emma's spark and my quieter temperament, and there's nothing I wouldn't do to see her smile. We had our routines, those little traditions that become the foundation of a family. Sunday mornings were all about pancakes. Sophie would perch on the kitchen counter, eagerly helping me stir the batter while Emma sipped her coffee, teasing me about my obsession with making the pancakes perfectly round. Saturday nights were our time. Once Sophie was tucked in, we'd curl up on the couch and watch old movies, the kind we could quote by heart but never tired of revisiting. Emma's job as the head of marketing at a major firm demanded a lot of her, but I admired how she handled it all with grace. She'd come home with stories about the campaigns she was leading or the challenges she'd overcome, her voice alive with passion. I'd listen, not just out of obligation but because I genuinely loved hearing her talk about the things she cared about. She made me proud every day, and I never stopped being amazed by her. But somewhere along the way, things began to shift. At first, it was so subtle that I didn't even notice it. The smiles Emma gave me seemed a little less warm, her laughter a bit more reserved. She started coming home later, blaming work deadlines and last-minute meetings. Our conversations, once filled with the easy rhythm of two people who knew each other inside out, became shorter, more surface level. I told myself it was just a busy season at work, that Emma was under a lot of pressure and needed time to decompress. I tried to be understanding, to give her space without taking it personally. After all, isn't that what you're supposed to do in a marriage? Support your partner, even when things feel off? But as the weeks turned into months, the distance between us only seemed to grow. It wasn't just her late nights or the way she brushed off my questions about her day. It was the little things, the way she flinched ever so slightly when I touched her, the way she avoided meeting my eyes when I told her I loved her. One night, as we lay in bed, I reached out to her, sliding my arm around her waist the way I'd done countless times before. It wasn't just a gesture of affection, it was a way of grounding myself, of reminding both of us that we were in this together. But instead of leaning into me like she usually did, Emma tensed. "I'm tired, Mark," she said softly, her voice distant. The words stung more than they should have. I withdrew my arm, lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. I told myself not to read too much into it, that it was just a moment, nothing more. But the heaviness in my chest refused to go away. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was like trying to hold on to water, the harder I tried to grasp what was slipping away, the more it eluded me. I'd catch her looking at her phone, her expression unreadable, or hear her laugh at something she'd never bothered to share with me. I wanted to ask her about it, but every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. Instead, I clung to the routines that had always brought us closer. I made pancakes on Sunday, hoping the familiar ritual would bridge the growing gap between us. Sophie chattered away as usual, her excitement filling the room, but Emma's laughter felt hollow, her smiles more like a mask than an expression of joy. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the tiny voice whispering that something was wrong. Have you ever felt that? The quiet, nagging fear that something precious is slipping through your fingers and there's nothing you can do to stop it? That was me, lying awake at night, replaying every interaction, searching for clues I didn't want to find. Looking back, I wonder if I should have acted sooner, if I should have confronted her the moment I sensed something was off. But hindsight is a cruel teacher. At the time, I told myself that love was enough, that the foundation we'd built over 8 years was unshakable. It's strange, isn't it? How you can look at someone you've shared a life with and realize you don't know what they're thinking, what they're feeling. I loved Emma. I still do, in a way. But love doesn't make you immune to doubt, and in those quiet moments when the house was still and Sophie was asleep, I couldn't stop the questions from creeping in. The change in Emma was gradual, almost imperceptible at first, like watching a shoreline slowly erode under constant waves. It wasn't one big event that made me question our relationship, it was the accumulation of small things, moments that added up to a picture I didn't want to see. She started staying late at work more often. "It's just the new campaign," she'd say, her tone calm, rehearsed even. "You know how demanding clients can be." And I did. I knew Emma's job wasn't 9 to 5, it required dedication, late nights, and the occasional weekend. I never questioned her commitment to her career. What nagged at me was the way she talked about it. She used to come home full of stories about her day, the brainstorming sessions, the meetings, the occasional drama with her team. But now, her updates were sparse, guarded. "It was fine," she'd say when I asked how her day had gone. If I pressed for details, she'd smile politely and change the subject, as though the walls she'd built between us were deliberate. One night, as I sat in the living room flipping through channels, I heard her voice from upstairs. She was on the phone, her tone softer than usual. At first, I didn't think much of it. Emma spent a lot of time talking to clients and colleagues, but something about the way she spoke caught my attention. I moved closer to the bottom of the stairs, straining to hear. "You did great," she said, her voice warm, encouraging. There was a pause, and then, "No, seriously, Nick. You've got a knack for this." Nick. That was the first time I heard his name, and something about it lodged in my brain like a thorn. The next day, I casually brought him up. "You were on the phone late last night," I said over breakfast. "Who were you talking to?" Emma didn't flinch, didn't miss a beat. "Nick," she replied. "He's one of the junior associates. He's new but sharp, full of ideas." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Why do you ask?" I shrugged, pretending not to care. "Just curious. You seem to mention him a lot." Her smile turned into a smirk, and she set her coffee cup down with a deliberate motion. "Mark, are you jealous?" Her tone was teasing, light, but there was an edge to it, a challenge I didn't know how to answer. "No," I said quickly, almost too quickly. "I was just asking." She laughed softly, a sound that felt more dismissive than amused, and got up to leave for work. From that moment on, Nick became a fixture in our conversations, or rather, in Emma's monologues. She'd bring him up casually, as though his name was just another part of her day, like a coffee order or a meeting agenda. "Nick had this great idea for the campaign," she'd say, her eyes lighting up. "He's really talented." I told myself it was harmless, that she was just excited about having a capable team member. But every time she talked about him, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. It wasn't just the way she talked about Nick. It was the way she seemed lighter, almost giddy, when she did. Her enthusiasm for his ideas, her praise for his work, it was the kind of energy she hadn't shown toward me in months. I started noticing other things, too. The way her phone was always within arm's reach, how she'd angled the screen away from me when she was texting. The way she suddenly cared more about how she looked before heading to the office, new dresses, a fresh shade of lipstick, even perfume I hadn't smelled on her in years. One evening, I came home early, pretending I wasn't feeling well. The house was quiet, and I headed upstairs, expecting to find Emma in her office. She was on the phone again, her voice low and soothing. "You've got this, Nick," she said. "Don't overthink it." I stood frozen outside her office door, the words hitting me like a bucket of cold water. She sounded different, gentler, more patient than she ever was with me these days. When she hung up, I stepped into the room. "Interesting conversation," I said, my voice betraying none of the unease I felt. Emma turned, startled but composed. "It's work," she said simply. "Stop overthinking everything, Mark." Her words should have been reassuring, but they weren't. They only added to the storm building inside me. I didn't push further that night, but the seed of doubt had taken root, and it was growing fast. Have you ever been in a situation where you know something's wrong but can't quite put your finger on it? That was me, sitting in the dark with 1,000 questions I didn't want to ask, terrified of the answers I might get. The name Nick started to haunt me, showing up like an uninvited guest in every corner of my life. It wasn't just Emma's frequent mentions of him, it was the way her demeanor changed whenever she talked about him. She seemed lighter, more animated, like he'd become a spark in her otherwise routine days. I told myself that I was overreacting, letting my imagination run wild. Emma was a professional, dedicated to her job. She had worked with plenty of men before, some of whom had even become good friends. But this felt different. It was one evening at dinner that the unease spilled over into outright suspicion. We were sitting across from each other, Sophie humming softly to herself as she poked at her mac and cheese. Emma was scrolling through her phone, smiling faintly at something on the screen. "What's so funny?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She glanced up, her smile fading slightly. "Oh, just a message from the team. Nick sent a meme about the campaign, it's silly." She turned the phone screen toward me, showing a harmless joke about marketing trends. I nodded, but something about the moment lingered, like a piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. That weekend, I decided to take Sophie out for some one-on-one time. It was something I cherished, just the two of us at the park, laughing as she insisted on pushing me on the swings for a change. But even then, I couldn't shake the thought of Emma and her growing connection with Nick. When we returned home, Emma was in the living room, her laptop open and her phone nearby. She looked up as Sophie rushed to show her a new drawing, her face lighting up in a way that felt genuine. For a brief moment, I let myself believe that everything was fine, that I was imagining things. But later that night, as Emma worked in her office and I sat in the bedroom, I couldn't resist the pull of my suspicions. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with a preview of a text. "Nick, couldn't have done it without you. Thanks, Emma." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. There was nothing inappropriate about the message on the surface, it was just a colleague expressing gratitude. But the familiarity in his tone, the way he addressed her so casually, gnawed at me. The next day, I confronted Emma about it. "You and Nick seem close," I said, trying to sound more curious than accusatory. She looked up from her coffee, her expression calm. "We work closely together. He's part of my team, Mark. That's all." "Is it?" I pressed, my voice firmer than I intended. Emma sighed, setting her cup down. "What do you want me to say? Nick is talented, and I appreciate his input. That doesn't mean there's anything more to it. You're making something out of nothing." Her words were measured, but the way she avoided my gaze told a different story. I wanted to believe her, to take her at her word and move on. But the growing distance between us, combined with her defensiveness, made it impossible. A few days later, I came home early again, determined to find some reassurance. As I walked in, I heard Emma on the phone in her office. Her voice was low, intimate. "I appreciate it, Nick," she said softly. "You're really helping me get through this." My chest tightened. "Get through what?" When I entered the room, she looked up, startled. "Mark, you're home early." "I wasn't feeling great," I replied, my voice neutral. She ended the call quickly, too quickly. "That was Nick. We were just going over some ideas for the campaign." I nodded, but the tension in the room was palpable. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was being hidden, that Emma was sharing a part of herself with Nick that she no longer shared with me. That night, as I lay awake beside her, I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. I kept replaying her words, her tone, the look in her eyes when she mentioned him. It all pointed to something I didn't want to admit but couldn't ignore. Have you ever felt like the life you've built is slipping away, and no matter how tightly you hold on, you can't stop it? That was me, lying in the dark, drowning in questions I was too afraid to ask. By the time the name Nick had cemented itself in my thoughts, it wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was a gnawing certainty I couldn't ignore. Emma continued to act as though everything was normal, but her version of normal was growing more detached, more secretive. She'd still smile at me across the dinner table or kiss me goodbye in the morning, but the warmth behind those gestures was gone, replaced by something that felt hollow, performative. The final straw came one evening when Emma announced she had another late night at the office. She had been leaving earlier and coming home later for weeks, often citing the same reason: the new campaign was demanding more of her time. Sophie was already asleep when Emma left, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor as she grabbed her bag and headed out the door. I sat alone in the living room, staring at the faint glow of the TV, the volume turned low so I wouldn't wake Sophie. My mind churned with thoughts I didn't want to have. I tried to convince myself, as I had so many times before, that I was overthinking things. But as the hours ticked by, my unease grew. At midnight, I gave in to the impulse that had been eating away at me for weeks. I reached for her phone, which she had carelessly left charging in the kitchen. The lock screen was innocuous enough, a picture of Sophie grinning at the camera. I felt a pang of guilt as I unlocked it, but the need for answers outweighed the shame. Her texts with Nick weren't explicit, but they were too personal for my comfort. Messages about work bled into conversations about life, peppered with compliments that felt too intimate to be purely professional. "Nick, I don't know how you juggle it all. You're incredible, Emma. Emma, you make it easier, Nick. Thank you for always being so understanding." I scrolled further, my stomach twisting. There were no outright confessions, no lines crossed that I could definitively point to. But it was clear they shared something, an emotional connection that felt like a betrayal all on its own. When Emma finally came home, I was still sitting on the couch, her phone resting on the coffee table in front of me. She looked surprised to see me awake, her face momentarily unreadable as she set her bag down. "You're up late," she said casually, though there was a slight edge to her voice. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I gestured to her phone. "Care to explain this?" Her eyes flicked to the phone, then back to me. She didn't move, didn't speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was sharp. "You went through my phone?" "You left me no choice," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "I see the way you talk about him. The way you light up when you mention his name. This isn't just work, Emma." Her expression shifted, a mix of indignation and something I couldn't quite place: guilt, maybe? She crossed her arms, her voice dropping to a cold calm. "Nick is a colleague. That's it. You're making something out of nothing because you're jealous." Her words cut deeper than I expected, but it wasn't her accusation that hurt, it was her lack of remorse. She wasn't apologizing, wasn't even trying to explain herself. Instead, she was deflecting, turning the blame back on me. "Do you even care how this makes me feel?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and pain. She sighed, her composure maddeningly intact. "Mark, I haven't crossed a line. But if you keep acting like this, spying on me, going through my phone, you're going to push me to a place neither of us can come back from." I stared at her, stunned. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. Calm, collected, almost dismissive, as though my feelings were an inconvenience she didn't have time for. Emma kissed my cheek, her lips cool against my skin, and walked upstairs without another word. I sat there for a long time, my thoughts racing. Had I gone too far? Was she right? Or was her calmness just a mask for something deeper, something she wasn't ready to admit? The worst part was that I didn't know. And in that moment, not knowing felt like the greatest betrayal of all. Have you ever been in a situation where every answer seems wrong, where the truth feels just out of reach, taunting you with its absence? That night, I realized the Emma I thought I knew was slipping further and further away, and I didn't know if I'd ever get her back. By now, my suspicions were no longer whispers in the back of my mind, they were deafening roars I couldn't ignore. Every interaction with Emma felt like a game, an exercise in navigating a minefield of half-truths and unspoken tensions. The space between us had grown into a chasm, and I was starting to wonder if it could ever be bridged. The moment that shattered everything came on a Tuesday evening. I had finished work early and decided to swing by Emma's office, hoping that maybe a surprise visit might rekindle something between us. I told myself it was a gesture of love, but deep down, I think I was looking for answers. As I parked my car near her building, I noticed Emma stepping out with Nick. They were laughing, their body language easy and familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. He touched her arm lightly as they walked toward her car, and she didn't pull away. I sat there frozen, watching them, my mind racing with possibilities. It could have been innocent. It could have been nothing. But after everything, how could I believe that? Against my better judgment, I got out of the car and approached them. My footsteps were heavy on the pavement, but neither of them noticed until I was just a few feet away. "Emma," I said, my voice cold and firm. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise before quickly narrowing into something more guarded. "Mark? What are you doing here?" Nick stepped back slightly, his face a mix of discomfort and curiosity. I ignored him, focusing on Emma. "We need to talk. Now." Emma's expression hardened. "Mark, this isn't the time or place." "Isn't it?" I shot back. My voice trembled with the weight of everything I wanted to say but couldn't. "You don't think this deserves an explanation?" Nick mumbled something about giving us space and hurried off, leaving Emma and me standing in the shadow of her office building. She crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "Mark," she began, her tone clipped, "you're making a scene." "A scene?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "Emma, I saw the way he looked at you. The way you looked at him. How can you stand there and act like I'm imagining this?" Her face didn't falter, her composure maddeningly intact. "Nick is a colleague," she said, her voice steady. "And you're embarrassing yourself." Her calmness was the final straw. It felt like a slap in the face, a dismissal of all the pain and doubt that had been eating away at me for months. "That's all you have to say?" I asked, my voice breaking. "That I'm embarrassing myself?" Emma sighed, shaking her head. "Mark, I haven't done anything wrong. But this paranoia of yours is tearing us apart." Her words hung in the air, a cruel irony I couldn't ignore. Paranoia? Maybe she was right. Maybe I had let my insecurities spiral out of control. But wasn't it her job to reassure me, to pull me back from the edge instead of pushing me further? That night, back at home, the tension was unbearable. We barely spoke, our silence heavy with unresolved conflict. When Sophie asked why Mommy and Daddy seemed sad, Emma forced a smile and brushed it off, saying we were just tired. But I wasn't tired. I was unraveling. Later, as Emma slept, I sat alone in the dark, replaying everything in my mind: the texts, the phone calls, the way she spoke to Nick, and her dismissal of my feelings. I had reached my breaking point, and I didn't know if there was any coming back from it. Have you ever reached a moment where you feel like you're watching your life fall apart in slow motion? That was me, sitting in the quiet of our bedroom, wondering if I had already lost her or if she had been gone long before I ever noticed. The final piece of the puzzle came the following week, though I didn't know at the time that it would be the moment my entire world unraveled and then, somehow, began to mend. Emma had another late night at work, and I was done sitting at home, torturing myself with doubts. I told Sophie I'd be back soon, kissed her goodnight, and drove to Emma's office. I parked a block away and waited, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. At around 9 p.m., I saw her. Emma exited the building, not alone. Nick was with her, his posture relaxed, his expression warm as they walked toward her car. She unlocked the door but didn't get in. Instead, they stood there talking, their voices low but their body language intimate. And then it happened, he leaned in, and she didn't pull away. Their kiss was brief but devastating, a blow I felt in every part of me. I sat there, stunned, the air knocked out of my lungs. This was it. The confirmation I hadn't wanted but couldn't stop seeking. I could have driven away, but something in me snapped. I got out of the car and approached them, my footsteps loud enough to make them both turn in unison. "Mark," Emma gasped, her face draining of color. Nick took a step back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. I didn't mean to." "Save it," I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. My eyes locked on Emma, who stood frozen, guilt written all over her face. "You kissed him. I saw it." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. I shook my head, the anger and hurt surging through me. "You've been lying to me, Emma. Hiding this, whatever it is. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Mark," she finally managed, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like. Please, let me explain. Explain? I laughed bitterly. You kissed him, Emma. How is there anything to explain? Nick muttered something about giving us space and disappeared into the night, leaving Emma and me standing in the harsh glow of the streetlights. Emma reached for me, but I stepped back. Please, Mark, she said, tears streaming down her face. It was a mistake. I never meant for this to happen. I stared at her, my chest heaving. A mistake? I repeated. You've been pulling away from me for months, Emma. You built this wall between us, and now you want to call it a mistake? She crumpled, her sobs racking her body. You're right. I've been distant, and I let things go too far. But I never stopped loving you, Mark. I swear. Her words cut deep, but so did the pain in her eyes. For the first time in months, I saw something raw and real in her: remorse, fear, desperation. Why, Emma? I asked, my voice breaking. Why did you do this? She wiped her tears, her hands shaking. I was lost, Mark. I felt invisible, like I wasn't enough anymore. And Nick, he paid attention, made me feel seen. But it was wrong. I know that now. I just didn't know how to tell you how I was feeling. Her words hit me like a gut punch. Had I been so focused on my own fears that I hadn't noticed hers? I didn't know what to say, so I turned and walked back to my car. Emma didn't follow me. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Emma gave me space, but she also didn't stop fighting for us. She wrote me letters, left them on my nightstand, each one an attempt to explain, to apologize, to promise she would do better. For Sophie's sake, I didn't rush to any decisions. We kept things civil, but the tension was palpable. I spent nights on the couch, my mind racing with questions I didn't have answers to. It was a moment with Sophie that changed everything. One afternoon, as I watched her color at the kitchen table, she looked up at me and said, "Daddy, are you still sad?" Her innocent question hit me hard. I realized that my anger and pain, while justified, were bleeding into the one thing I cared about most, my family. That night, I sat down with Emma. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes, bracing herself for the worst. I'm angry, I began. I don't know if I can ever forget what you did. But for Sophie's sake and for the sake of what we had, I'm willing to try. Her face crumpled with relief, and for the first time in what felt like forever, we really talked. About the distance that had grown between us, about the things we'd both neglected in our marriage. Emma agreed to cut all ties with Nick and to start therapy, both individually and as a couple. I made my own promises, to listen more, to make her feel valued again. It wasn't an easy road, but over time, we began to rebuild. Slowly, cautiously, we found our way back to each other. And though the scars of what happened remained, so did the hope that we could come out stronger on the other side. Some might say I was a fool to stay, but when I look at Sophie's smile, when I feel Emma's hand in mine, I know I made the right choice. What would you have done in my place? Could you forgive, or would you walk away? Can trust truly be rebuilt after such a breach? What does it mean to forgive, and how does one move forward without forgetting? What do you think of this ending? Would you have chosen a different path for Mark and Emma? Write in the comments.